So let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our public debriefing after the 36th BEREC plenary meeting that we held last week in Slovenia. I'd like to start with a short information about a workshop BEREC held last week at the margins of our plenary meeting. We took the opportunity now that the code is finalized that we were discussing the mode of operations of BEREC for the coming years. Given all the tasks that we have received with the code, we thought it would be appropriate and timely to discuss a little bit how we can spend our time together wisely in the coming years. And we discussed issues like stakeholder engagement and involvement, access to documents, our expert working group structure. We also discussed how we can address more strategic and more forward-looking issues in the interest of the digital economy and our stakeholders in the telecom sector. And we also discussed how we can move from a more annual work program to a multi-annual program. We thought it would be appropriate to come to a more fluent and revolving work program than just a very static annual program. So the discussions or the outcomes of the discussions will feed in an update in our rules of procedure that will be published soon, could be after P4 or P1 next year. So we are in the course of updating our rules of procedure to reflect not only our discussion, but also BEREC regulation and the code. And we will keep you updated on the outcomes of that. So this was the short information about the workshop we had, and now I will debrief you on the documents we have adopted during plenary 3 this year. The first report that we have adopted for public consultation is a report on contractual simplification. This is already a kind of pre-work for a task foreseen in the code. BEREC has to deliver input to the Commission implementing acts on contract summary templates within 12 months after enter into force of the code. We think that it is important that contracts with end users provide clear and relevant information in a manner that is easily to understand and simple in order to make to give users the opportunity to make informed choices. And it was the plan to create such a contract summary template. Based upon the code, it is now up to the Commission to make such a template, and the Commission has to do it after consulting BEREC. So this report will be the basis for our input to the Commission. The objective of the report was to collate information on practices and initiatives in member states already in place. We wanted to provide relevant information that NRAs can use or refer to for any initiative they may undertake. And as I said, it's the basis already for work foreseen under the code. So the findings in this report are that in several member states, measures and initiatives have been taken so far to clarify matters in consumer contracts. Based upon Article 102 of the Code, 7 key information elements must be included in the Commission's implementing act, and we have found out during the discussions that under these key information elements there might be numerous sub-elements for different kind of contracts that might to be addressed in such a summary contract template. For instance, under the title Prices for the Services, it was found that this could also include costs such as installation costs, activation cost, total periodic charge for the service, and others. Or, for instance, for mobile, very relevant out-of-bundle charges. We made this report by sending out a survey to the NRAs. Firstly, to gather information on actual measures, and secondly, to collate an NRA's ranking of the key information elements. And we have made a ranking in our draft report. And the 5 highest ranking information elements are identity of the trader / operator, the services included in the offer, the total periodic charge for the service, the minimum duration of the contract, and information on quality of service. We have, as I said, distinguished also between different types of services. So now the report will be published for consultation. The deadline will be the 7th of November. And we expect that the Commission will seek our input on this implementing act in first quarter 2019, and in quarter 2 we will provide the input to the Commission. It is also, as far as I can see, included in our work program that Jeremy Godfrey will introduce later. So the second report I wanted to talk to you that we adopted during the second plenary is the report on the implementation of the net neutrality regulation. It is the second BEREC implementation report since the entry into force of the net neutrality regulation in 2016. And the report wants to give an overview about the activities that NRAs have undertaken in the course of implementing the net neutrality provisions and the guidelines. So the reporting period is May 2017 until April 2018. And to write the report, an internal questionnaire was sent out to the NRAs. We received 29 responses, and the basis for this report are public information about national net neutrality cases or investigations. And I want to emphasize that this is not an exhaustive list, but because there are for sure pending cases, and these are not included. So what did we find? With regard to Article 3 of the TSM that is dealing with commercial and technical conditions, we found that zero rating offers are available in almost all countries. So in 27 countries we have seen zero rating offers are on the market. The most common types of zero rating offers were, of course, music and video streaming, as well as access to social networking platforms. It has to be noted here once again, because I think this is sometimes not that clear, that zero rating per se is not forbidden under the regulation. And so the report found that in no country a zero rating product was banned based on Article 3.2, but most assessments of zero rating were also done on the basis of traffic management, which is Article 3.3. And there were some offers that allowed access to zero-rated services after the data cap had been reached. So this is really a technical measure that is, from our perspective, clearly forbidden under the code. So zero-rating offers in the markets were tackled only because of this technical discrimination based upon the provision of traffic management. So traffic management practices alone were assessed formally only by a very small number of NRAs so far. It can also be noted that there are ongoing monitoring activities for so-called specialized services as well. Nearly all NRAs monitor specialized services by checking ISPs' offers on their website, sending information requests, or analyzing complaints. So far, only Austria has taken a decision in this regard by ordering an ISP to stop prioritization of a video-on-demand service in combination with IPTV, but this case is still court pending, and decision by court is expected later this year or early next year. With regard to the application of Article 4 of the DSM that is dealing with transparency measures and contractual terms, it has to be noted that national specifications in relation to different types of speed-related information, like maximum, normal available, or minimum speed, this was set up by 15 NRAs in Europe. What is also worth to mention is that in almost half of the countries, ISPs have not yet included required speed information in their contracts. The report also states that most NRAs monitor end-user complaints about the performance of the Internet access service, and in the meantime, 2/3 of NRAs offer an Internet access service quality monitoring mechanism to consumers. So what's next on the issue of open Internet and net neutrality? BEREC will continue to exchange about cases within the net neutrality expert working group to contribute to a consistent application of the regulation, of course. And we will publish in plenary 4 and BEREC opinion on the evaluation of the net neutrality regulation. So this will feed into this evaluation of the net neutrality regulation, will feed into the Commission's work on evaluating the net neutrality rules according to the DSM. They have to do it until end of April 2019. A further document that we have adopted during our last plenary was a document on the public consultation on data economy. During our second plenary in Poland earlier this year, we held a workshop on issues that we call data economy and how the development of a data-driven economy impacts the work of regulators. And as a kind of teaser, I would like to introduce to you now a video where we summarize a little bit and tease you to contribute to our consultation.
In every blink of an eye, machines, systems, and we ourselves create an incredible amount of data. Collecting and analyzing it generates invaluable knowledge in the new data economy. Data opens up completely new business models, lets consumers make informed choices, and boosts growth. Under the best circumstances, the data economy could contribute up to 1,000 billion euros to the European Union gross domestic product by 2025. Telecoms operators are a key intermediary in the data economy. The precious resource of information flows across their digital networks. Safeguarding competition in the telecom sector, BEREC uses tools which may be useful in the transition towards a data-driven economy in Europe, affecting all sectors. In order to evaluate the influence of the data economy on regulation and to detect potential bottlenecks, BEREC wants to know your view. What could be the impact of data economy on the telecommunications value chain? Which of BEREC's existing regulatory tools may be efficient to safeguard competition? How can BEREC foster innovation in the data economy? Participate now in the public consultation on data economy and let your voice be heard.
So let me once again emphasize that we would really love to hear your input on this very much future-oriented topic. It is, I think, very important that national regulatory authorities and BEREC deal with these issues in order to, as we do it in other areas, identify and eliminate hurdles for a prosperous development of our economy. So the objectives of this exercise is to identify issues for NRAs in relation to the transition towards a data-driven economy. We think it's important to consider the interrelations with ex-post regulatory activities and the work of other institutional bodies like data protection authorities. And we want to analyze the impact of data on our sector and the potential influence on NRA's market analysis. The public consultation is launched today, and it is open for 6 weeks until the 21st of November. And we will put different topics on the table. We start with a general definition of the data economy, as well as identifying potential bottlenecks that we see. We are exploring the role of communication networks and services as a key enabler for the data economies. We want to look into characteristics and future evolutions and developments of electronic communication services. And as data is a very important factor affecting the dynamics of competition, we want to have your views on that as well. We want to look into the question of commercializing data instead of billing users for these services, and so on. So data can also be an enabler for well-informed regulatory decisions, and the sharing of data could also increase the benefit to end users and to the economy as a whole. And we want to have a very open discussion, and we really want to identify areas where we as sector-specific regulators should get active in order to identify and eliminate hurdles. So once again, the public consultation is open until the 21st of November, and I really would like to cordially invite you to contribute to our consultation. And now I have the honor to, well, not introduce to you, but hand over to my colleague Jeremy Godfrey, who is incoming chair of BEREC this year and will be the chair of BEREC 2019. And he is in the course of preparing the work program for 2019, and he will give you an overview of the work that is planned for next year. Jeremy, please.
Thank you, Johannes. So Johannes said to me I was very lucky that all I had to do in preparing the work program was read the code, and that would tell me what to do. Of course, as we were preparing the work program, the code kept changing, so I'm not sure it made things so much easier for us. And of course, we didn't want to end up being entirely dominated by the code. So we started the process in the spring with a public call for inputs for ideas that might be in the 2019 work program. And I know that some of you here today provided us with those inputs. Since then, working with the Board of Regulators, we've looked at the mandatory tasks from the code. We've looked at the ideas that we had from outside stakeholders. We've looked at the ideas that NRAs had, and looking at the resources available, we've come up with this work program, which we're now about to consult on. Thank you. So some main themes from what we've done. One is that, as Johannes said, we've started to think about planning on a multi-annual process rather than just on a year-by-year. And essentially that was an essential thing to do. There are many tasks, guidelines and so forth required by the code, but most of them don't need to be delivered in 2019. Many of them have deadlines extending into 2020 and up to the transposition date. So we've done a plan which includes, which spreads the work out over those 2 years. That was really a way of being quite practical. We would need to start much of that work in 2019, but quite a lot of it will actually complete in 2020. Second theme to get across is that there is a lot of work for BEREC to do in ensuring a harmonised, coherent implementation of the code and other legislation. I think there were lots of discussions during the code and the BEREC regulation about what the structure of BEREC should be, and one of the things that I think members of the Board of Regulators liked about the current structure of BEREC was that it enables hundreds of experts, maybe several hundreds of experts from NRAs collaborating together in expert working groups. The practitioners bring their expertise to the development of the guidelines and the best practices. So that's something which I think we are humbled to have been entrusted with by the co-legislators. Many more tasks of that nature. And so that's one thing that it is going to be a very large percentage of the work over the next 2 years. But the third thing I wanted to say was that we do need to continue to look to the future. So BEREC has, I think, played a role in helping to shape and contribute towards a conversation on longer-term issues. So just as Johannes was talking about the data economy, we want to make sure that we don't just focus purely on the operational delivery of rather dry guidelines. And lastly, we want to talk about collaborating with stakeholders. So again, there's collaboration obviously with the industry and sector stakeholders. That occurs primarily through the consultation processes and on the individual projects. But obviously we have we have things like the stakeholder forum and so forth. Anyway, I will talk a little bit about each of those. So in terms of the kind of the work on harmonising implementation, we have in the work programme 12 sets of guidelines, and I'm going to just focus on just a few of them. They're all in the document for you to comment on. The first one up there is actually not code related; it's TSM related. So I think the work we've done on net neutrality this year in preparation to give an opinion to the Commission next year on the review of the regulation has also highlighted some areas where some clarification or updating of the guidelines might be useful. So on this, a little bit depends on whether the Commission decides it wants to review the regulation. But in any event, we think it would be useful for BEREC to start work on looking at the guidelines next year. So that's one of the issues that I know will be of interest to stakeholders. A second guideline I want to point out is the intra-EU calls. I highlight that one just because it's going to be the first one we deliver as a result of the code, because the obligations on the euro rate for intra-EU calls will come into force quite early in 2019. There's a provision for NRAs to give derogations in certain circumstances, and a requirement on BEREC to have guidelines to assist NRAs in considering applications for derogations. So in order for that to be useful, that we think those guidelines need to be in place before the obligation kicks in. So that will be the first set of guidelines we deliver. And then I've highlighted two others which are probably of greater longer-term significance. Obviously, much of the discussion on the code was around issues to do with investment and connectivity. And in particular, there was a lot of discussion about co-investment, a lot of discussion about symmetric regulation. Again, in both those cases, there are guidelines that BEREC has been invited to produce to assist NRAs in applying them. Those new rules, and those will be significant pieces of work for BEREC. There's also, as well as the guidelines, there are opinions for the Commission. Johannes already talked about the contract summary template. Another example is an opinion on the functioning of the roaming market. A new task for BEREC in the code is to develop some databases. So as well as guidelines, there's a task to maintain some databases, of which I would say the most significant is the database of authorised undertakings. So associated with that project, not only does BEREC have to build the database, we also have to have, I think, some guidelines on the information to be provided so that the database can be consistent across the European Union. And finally, I've put under this is kind of much lower profile work, that the role of BEREC in providing a forum for experience sharing amongst NRAs is something that I think that is highly valued, and particularly in a time when we have a lot of work to do on the code, we don't have a lot of bandwidth to do reports on best practices and so forth. But a more useful thing to do is really just to share in some workshops at technical level, for example, on the operation of margin squeeze tests, how different NRAs have addressed that. And we will probably publish some summaries of what's said at those workshops. Thanks. In terms of looking forward, we have a very limited capacity to do this other work, but we've focused on. I'll highlight three elements there. One is on 5G. So 5G has been a big theme for BEREC this year, and we want to continue to think longer term about 5G. So whereas maybe much of the discussion has been about spectrum and how it should be assigned, we think there are some longer term issues that will be necessary from two perspectives. One is, how does 5G affect all the other aspects of regulation? So at what time and in what way should the availability of 5G, for example, be taken into account in doing market analysis of wholesale broadband markets? On the other side of things, the regulation can play an important role in either enabling or inhibiting the development of innovative services that use in the 5G ecosystem. So there will be issues like do we need different roaming rules for 5G? What about switching rules? What about is there likely to be a need for developers of 5G applications to be able to assess coverage across the whole of the Union on a consistent basis? So do we need to be, would a pan-European coverage map or pan-European coverage data be useful in enabling the development of applications? So this is a project which we think will try to identify the questions and maybe identify some of the possible answers to the questions, but it's really a pathfinder for more detailed work in future years. The second is really a response to the new objective in the code of promoting connectivity and promoting take-up across the in very high capacity networks. And we want, again, there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about what are the drivers of investment in new networks. We want to maybe take a slightly different angle on this and look at some of the, particularly look at some of the feedback loops. We think it's a very complicated system. Everything affects everything else. So to give an example, the case for investment in a high capacity network may depend in part on predictions of demand for this and take-up. But demand and take-up will depend on the availability of applications that require the network. And the case for applications providers to invest in developing those applications will depend on the addressable market. But the addressable market, of course, depends on the rollout of the network. So we want to try and understand what kind of feedback loops exist and what the implications of those might be for regulation, and whether there are, sometimes you find in these circumstances that quite small regulatory interventions can have a much bigger effect than you think. So, that's, I think, already gone out to tender for some experts to assist us in pulling together that model. And the third thing I've highlighted there is again, as Johannes just talked about, the data economy. We'll be finalising that report after the public consultation. And then we're also planning to do a couple of other workshops that focus on the future. One will be a workshop looking towards a vision for Europe's telecom consumers. There was our colleagues in the energy sector have had such a vision And so I think for us to be thinking about, what should the single market, digital single market, mean for consumers is a good question to ask. We'll have that workshop, and that may then feed into the following year's medium-term strategy for BEREC. And one last workshop, again, we think a very important topic, is how to handle migration from copper networks to fibre-based networks. And we want to, again, start to share some experience of how NRAs are thinking about how they would, what the issues are, say, of the withdrawal of copper networks, how those should be handled from a regulatory perspective. So again, it's early for that, days for that, so we think to start with a workshop to, again, scope out the issues, share experience is the right thing to do. And finally, if I talk about stakeholders, I already mentioned the kind of the importance of engaging with industry stakeholders through the usual consultation processes and the other events we have. We also, I think, particularly want to continue the close collaboration with stakeholders within the EU institutions, the Commission. RSPG is an important the collaboration with RSPG on peer reviews and so forth is important, and there are a number of other EU institutions and bodies that it's important for us to collaborate with in thinking, particularly in thinking about the future. And from an international perspective, we also want to maintain a dialogue with colleagues. And one thing that we especially want to highlight is the Western Balkans. So there's a Commission initiative to work with the Western Balkans to gradually approximate many of the things in those economies as preparation for accession, and we have been asked and are very willing to play our part in working with them on telecoms issues and ECS issues. Thank you. I should maybe add one other thing that I haven't put on the slides, which is that on the 12th of December 2009, the regulation that established BEREC came into force, or was published in the official journal. So 2019 will be the 10th anniversary year of BEREC, and we're planning some events, including some stakeholder events, to mark that occasion. Then I think they're not in the work programme yet, but we'll probably say more about that after P4. So the next steps on the work programme are public consultation, so that we launch that today. Again, that will close on the 7th of November. We will take into account the views expressed. We will update the work programme, update the project specifications that underlie the work programme, and then after P4, we'll publish the final version of the work programme. And just on that last bullet point, the new BEREC regulation, assuming it does come into force in December, as everyone expects, contains in it a provision that BEREC should, as well as doing its annual work programme, should do an outline work programme for the kind of the year after next, I suppose. So by the end of January, we'll be required to publish an outline work programme for 2020. As it happens, of course, because we've been already planning on a 2-year basis, that will not be too troublesome for us. And again, we'll communicate that work programme, and it will also be an opportunity for people to respond to the outline work programme as part of the cycle for then finalising the 2020 work programme during the second half of next year. And that's all I have to say. Thank you, Johannes.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much for putting together the work program for 2019. From my perspective, it is a very, very ambitious work program, in particular because many of the things we have to do have very strict deadlines, and we want to deliver all these tasks within the deadlines. So as we have shown you, we are already now, to a certain extent, preparing ourselves already for these tasks, and we are pretty confident that we can deliver all that is required from BEREC. And Jeremy, I wish you all the best for accomplishing the work program.
If I may just say one other thing. As Johannes says, it's an ambitious work program for us, and we realise that also is an ambitious work program for our stakeholders in responding to the consultations. But I think so we are all in the same boat here, and we look forward to receiving your inputs, even if it means that you, like us, will have to work a bit harder to get things done in time.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Well, there were, of course, some other activities that we have completed during our third plenary, and there is one particular thing I wanted to mention, that we have signed an MOU with the Canadian Regulatory Authority, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. We have visited, as the BEREC Mini Board in late March this year, our Canadian friends, and we established a closer relationship to them, and Commissioner Ian Scott was our honorable guest in Slovenia, and at this occasion we signed an MOU with Canada, and there are 4 areas of cooperation that we intend to work on in the coming years. And these areas are next generation access and broadband development, consumer protection, net neutrality and open internet, and competition in markets. And we are really looking forward to a close cooperation with our Canadian friends. Finalizing, I want to mention some other outcomes of the plenary, other documents that we have adopted. There is the periodic international roaming BEREC benchmark data report. We have also finalized a BEREC report on the location on the network termination point. This is also a kind of a pre-work for next year, where we have to issue guidelines on that. We have also adopted a BEREC report on European benchmark of the pricing of bundles and methodology guidelines. This is insofar a very particular and important work that because studies of the European Commission on the pricing of bundles in Europe are based upon this methodology, and given the fact that more and more consumers buy their ECS in bundles, so it was necessary to update the methodology used for that, and we have done that, and this is the outcome, and we expect that the Commission will rely upon this methodology in their future studies. We have also adopted the BEREC input to the European Commission work on the WACC. We have issued our BEREC open data policy. It has to be said there that we will publish or when we publish our reports, we will immediately publish also the data or the databases for these reports in form of excellent CSV files. So we want to become increasingly open so that stakeholders can directly access the data we are using. I think this is one of the major issues we have and that we want to drive in order to increase stakeholder engagement and to be more open to the public. We have also adopted a report on pricing for access to infrastructure and civil works according to the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. And finally, we have adopted the BEREC report on international mission to Canada and the US, which is basically a description of our study trip earlier this year to Canada and the US. I want to just give you now an additional overview on the public consultation. There are 4 of them starting today. First of all, the work program for 2019, then the report on contractual simplification, and the report on pricing for access to infrastructure and civil works according to the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. All 3 of them are open until 7th of November. And the public consultation on data economy is open for 6 weeks until 21st of November. So what is next? I would really love to invite you to our next week's Stakeholder Forum on the 17th of October 2018. There will be different panel discussions. We will also present the work program in more detail, and there will be the opportunity to discuss matters of mutual interest during this session. The next plenary will take place in Prague on the 6th and the 7th of December, and the next public debriefing will be in the following week on the 12th of December here in Brussels. So that's it from my side, and now we are open for discussion and if there are any questions. Thank you. So, great. Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you for the debriefing. This is Jorge Morillo from Telefónica. I had a doubt on the timescales of the guidelines. I don't know if you can elaborate a bit more on the guidelines, especially on the interview calls. As you mentioned it, the deadlines are very tight. And I don't know if you can elaborate this, if we can expect something before the end of the year so we can have a bit more guidance to start working internally.
So I think I'll come back to the intra-EU calls. I think the others are challenging but not impossible. And one of the things also we're trying to do is, to the extent we can, we will schedule the consultation and then the final decision to have not the final decision not to be at the next plenary, but the plenary after, so that there's a little bit more time for people to respond, wherever that's possible. And there's a variety of deadlines in the code. Some of them are within 24 months, some of them are within 18 months, a few are within 12. So we were thinking P1, P2, P3, P4, and then we've got P5, 6, 7, and 8. So I think the scheduling, we're trying to make things as easy as we can, both for ourselves and for our stakeholders. The guidelines on intra-EU calls are a much bigger challenge, because there really isn't time to do the kind of normal process we would normally want to go through for that. So we're planning to have some workshops with stakeholders early in 2019, and to produce those guidelines it's in May. In May, so we'll have a discussion, I think, at our first plenary, but we'll probably have to adopt them electronically. So it'll be a challenge. We will do them before the rule comes into force, but it may not be very far before that, I'm afraid.
There is one particular issue that Jeremy mentioned, and I really want to emphasize it. So, given the strict deadlines, there will not be always the opportunity to do it the way we have done it in the past, so that we issue a draft report and we go through a public consultation. But of course, stakeholder involvement is of utmost importance. We will try to be more flexible, do it in different ways than just a consultation, maybe as Jeremy said, in form of workshops, but we will ensure a proper stakeholder involvement in what we do next year on the guidelines. Mr. Füg.
Thank you very much for the microphone. So this is Oliver Füg from the European Competitive Telecommunications Association. I'd have for you, Johannes, a question, because I hope that the study will still be launched under your reign. But the study that has been advertised on the BEREC website recently on the determinants of investment in very high capacity networks, where do you see this leading? What do you have an idea of what methodology and what data outcome you're expecting from this, and by when this will be finalized? I mean, are we expecting this by mid-2019 and 2019 for the 10th anniversary, or And the second question is on 5G. I mean, that's been a very prominent topic under your reign at the forefront of BEREC, and I was curious to know whether you could share a little bit more of insight on the collaboration with RSPG and how that will be going forward in 2019 on the topic of 5G. Thank you very much.
I'd like to start with the 5G topic because the study on investment that you mentioned is part of the 2019 work program. We started working now, and Jeremy can talk in more detail about the methodology applied and the timetable. So on 5G, indeed, this was an important topic, or has been an important topic this year, and of course, we reached out also to other stakeholders like the RSPG. Now, for what is of utmost importance to us in terms of collaboration with RSPG is the definition of the handling of the peer review. There is the role of RSPG. There is the role of BEREC in this peer review, and we have planned a first meeting next week in order to discuss how we will treat this issue, whether it is a kind of very particular work on particular auctions, or is it a more general approach on experience exchanges, sharing of best practices. So we are in an early stage of working together with RSPG on that topic, and we will of course debrief you as soon as we have any findings on that. But I think the collaboration with RSPG will, in the years to come, one of the crucial elements of harmonization on spectrum issues in Europe.
Thank you. Yes, let me talk a little bit about the study, and maybe I'll start off by saying what it isn't, and then I'll come on to say what it is. So I think in the past we've tried to look at some macroeconomic correlations. Looking at how much investment has there been in particular markets, what other things can you measure, what seems to be correlated. And that's turned out to be a somewhat difficult process because of the difficulty in getting consistent data across so many markets. So this time we want to take a somewhat different approach. And you asked about kind of the technique to be used. We're envisaging using a technique known as systems dynamic modeling or dynamic simulation. And that involves not treating the marketplace as a black box and you look at inputs and outputs and try to correlate them. In fact, you try to build a kind of a qualitative understanding of how the different drivers within the market are linked together. And that will be based on input from a number of experts, not just experts within the NRAs. We envisage engagement with industry experts so that a wide variety of perspectives is gathered. And generally, I think what you find is that nobody's perspective is wrong, but everybody's perspective is incomplete. And the idea is to try and create what can look like a rather complicated spaghetti diagram that incorporates all those perspectives, but some insights can come out of that. So the first phase of work that we're envisaging is a qualitative phase to gather those perspectives, see how they fit together, and also to, in parallel with that will be some review of the academic literature and so forth. The idea is to have a report for publication after P3 next year of the qualitative phase. What we have in mind is that would then be followed by a quantitative phase, which would involve turning the qualitative model into a quantitative simulation model, which can be calibrated for different markets. So we will pick maybe 3 exemplar markets where, we won't do every market in the EU, but we'll try and pick ones where we think a big market, a small market, a market where there's been a lot of investment in fibre, a market where there hasn't been, this kind of thing, so that we can see to what extent the insights, we may get some different insights about different situations. And then what you do with those models is you calibrate them so they predict the past well. You tweak the parameters in the model, the coefficients in the equations, so that they align with reality. But because the perspectives and because the if you like, the way in which the model is constructed is based on good insights about the drivers, you actually need much less data than in other approaches in order to do a good calibration. And then it's possible to run some experiments on those simulation models. So you can say, well, if a different approach had been taken in the past to some aspect of regulation, what might the outcome have been? And similarly, you can ask the same questions about the future. So the idea would then be to run some experiments to try and get some insights into what impact the tools available to regulators and policymakers have had in the past and what impact they might have in the future. And that's something which will run into 2020 before we have some output from it. That's the kind of idea we have behind the study.
So thank you, Chairman. That's in short about the study. So Aurélie.
That was quite long.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, if I just may follow up with one small question on the regulatory environment. You said, well, knowing what had happened in the past, what if the regulation had been tweaked, what would the results have been? Is the idea then also to look at investment-related regulation that might have had an impact on investment activity in the electronic communication sector?
Yes, absolutely. I think, when you kind of want to look at what are the outcomes that you're interested in, and one of the key outcomes will be investment, or possibly not just the amount of investment, but what is it actually delivered in terms of additional connectivity. So how has connectivity evolved? What could have happened, what might have happened in the past that could have had a result in accelerating the development of that connectivity? What are the lessons, if we try to simulate the future, again, what lessons can we learn?
Okay, now Aurélie.
Thank you, Johannes. Aurélie Doutrio from Orange. It was a follow-up question from Telefonica first issue on the international call guidelines. I just wanted to better understand the scope. Will you focus, because according to the BEREC regulation or code, BEREC has to adopt guidelines on the derogation. Will it only cover derogation, or will you also give some insight on your interpretation as you did for roaming, for example? Thank you.
I think the very first thing we will do will be to focus on the guidelines for derogation. So that's the absolute mandatory task. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, we could potentially, I think it's if you think we should widen the scope of that, please say that in your response to the work programme. It's a draft work programme at the moment, so we can take account of anything you say.
Thank you. Please.
Magnus Franklin from Teneo. On Brexit, have you been doing any contingency planning? Do you foresee any role for Ofcom post-March?
What I can say, this is of course a topic within BEREC. We are closely cooperate with the Commission on this topic, and there is of course a planning for the time after Brexit. But so far there are several options on the table, from hard Brexit to no deal, from hard Brexit to no deal, from hard Brexit to no Brexit. So we are still, as I said, being in close cooperation and with the Commission, and that's, I think, all we can do currently, and monitor what's going on.
Yeah, it's Peter Dunn from Cullen. Just going back to the work programme, it's clear that the Commission sort of has kind of set your work programme to a large extent, excuse me, which has limited your discretion. So can you say, are there one or two things that you really regret not being able to include in the work programme for the next couple of years?
Non, je ne regrette rien. I think if I look at the list of projects that narrowly missed the cut, if you like. What we've tried to do with those is turn them into less resource-intensive projects. So I think they tended to be around the quite a lot of it was the kind of the meat and drink of sharing experience. So, for example, I talked about we're going to do a workshop on margin squeeze tests. If we'd had more resource and had less other things to do, we might have done a more extensive project on best practices or a common position on the application of margin squeezes. So those are the things that we've tried to do them in a lighter way rather than eliminating them altogether. But we've also particularly, I think, tried to protect doing some of those longer term issues. So as we say, the study and the work on 5G, the work on the data economy, those are the things which might not have made the cut, but we decided that it was important to have at least some projects of that nature.
Okay, any other question, please?
Thank you. Henk Mannekens, BT. I'd just like to return to the 2018 program, if possible. There was listed that the BEREC would issue a report on access to physical infrastructure and also look at the question what are the pros and cons of eventually defining it as a separate market. So my question is, can you tell, because I don't see anything in the current meeting, is this still in the planning, and when will it be proposed?
Well, yeah, the particular report that you mentioned is planned for plenary 4. So it's still in the work program, of course, and we will adopt it in plenary 4 from today's perspective.
And then there will be a consultation or
P2 2019 in the work program.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, there will be the adoption will be for public consultation, and the finalization will be in P2 2019. Yeah. We have received a question via Twitter, I guess. Could you say something about the results of the public consultation on the evaluation of the TSM regulation and the net neutrality guidelines? Which areas of the net neutrality guidelines are you looking to update in 2019? To be honest, we have discussed during plenary 3 now some topics on this evaluation. The expert working group has given or has asked BEREC or the Board of Regulators for guidance on certain topics, and we will then issue the report on in P4, and in 2019, I mean, after 3 years of experience with the net neutrality guidelines, we thought that it would be a good idea to update it. There might be some clarifications needed in some areas, but at this point, I don't want to go into detail which parts of the guidelines will be updated. So I would like to ask you for a little bit of patience that is needed, because you can never say we are a group of 28 and there are many more observers. So until we have a clear formulation in a paper, you cannot say what our real opinion is. So please have a little bit of patience, and we will come up in P4 with it. Okay, so then if there are no further questions, I would then like to close the public debriefing. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your questions and contributions. And once again, I'd like to invite you to next week's Stakeholder Forum in order to discuss further topics, in particular the work program for 2019. And please participate in our consultations. They're open as of today, and we are looking very much forward to your contributions. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.